minutes to 6, maybe 4 minutes to 6. Let's give everybody a quick break, and we'll recess if we have to and come back to the questions. So the floor is who's? Lisa's, I think. Is that right? You can tell I'm not used to it. Who gets to jump up there? Who wants to jump up there to the microphone?
Good evening, Vice Mayor and council members. Tonight we have consultants here that have been assigned the task of the Sonoran Valley Public Safety Master Plan. We have Rick Rayfelt from MWL, and we have Ronnie Coleman from ESCI, representing both fire and police.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Good evening, council members and Vice Mayor. I'll go through this quickly. I know you've had a chance to review the summary report, which is the stage we're at with Lisa last week. Ron Coleman will jump in occasionally. He's very familiar with fire stuff. McLaren Wilson Lowry is an architectural firm, and we deal mostly in public safety, dealing on the police side. I'm going to try and leave most of the time for Sarah Murley, who is here with the Applied Economics, to present the fiscal impact, which is really the new information for you that you haven't seen before. This is the summary report leading up next month to the final report. These are the subjects that we have discussed with you previously and some new information. I want to remind you that the master plan is a process. It was based upon no conceived solutions. We asked questions. We used our experience to guide the fire and police staff through the process. This is a plan, a recommended course of action for consideration by the departments and by the city. Whoops, my screen went away there. I'm going to go back one. Oops. I'm sorry, I'm not always familiar with this.
You were there.
Okay. Let me talk about the study area. Last year, the city of Goodyear increased by 37%, so that obviously had a large impact on your public safety facilities program. You're 36 miles north to south, 5 to 6 miles east to west. There's some geographical separations that you have to deal with, the Gila River and a wildlife corridor in the southern part. We know that your population is going to increase perhaps by 5%, by 5 times within the next 22 years. With that will come a proportional increase in public safety calls for service. The future land use is going to be of a higher density nature, most likely, and there could be the potential for leapfrog development, some of which you're already familiar with has occurred. The general plan objectives are to protect life and safety, enhance existing levels of service, evaluate staff performance, secure critical infrastructure. One thing I must point out, that Goodyear is unusual and that you are unbalanced. Your growth is going to occur in the south, all your existing stuff is in the north, and you have no roadway connecting it right now, but that's going to change big time. So the service level objectives that we've identified with staff are effective and equitable facilities configuration leading to some sort of equivalent level of service throughout the city. A balance of centralized and decentralized facilities, meaning that there are some support facilities that aren't on the ground that need to probably be in several locations. We probably can't concentrate it all in the north area. We'll try and come up with some sort of phased and flexible facility configuration. The implementation plan addresses that. And we need to accommodate all the future staffing that we think is projected at this point in time. We've reviewed previous work on the matrix report and the Public Safety Committee. The items that are listed there that they found particularly important: measurable performance, utilization of existing facilities, increased patrol officer productivity to 30%, establish a 90% travel time for fire, and implement residential fire sprinkler ordinance. That's the highlights of many of the items that came out of those two reports. We've done an analysis of risk and demand. The police department workload is primarily generated by calls for service, and that's directly proportional to population. As your population goes up, it's going to be more calls. There's a geographical risk component that's unique in Goodyear because of your distance and because of your geographical boundaries, barriers through the city, and the distance that you have to deal with. We're particularly concerned that any facility configuration provides sufficient patrol officer backup. I think that's a critical thing to emphasize here. Ronnie, do you want to talk about the fire workload?
Yes, to just paraphrase what's on the board up there regarding fire department workload, what we attempted to do was to replicate the existing community by cloning neighborhoods and then putting those neighborhoods into the topography based on time and distance and the sequence of events with which we anticipated that growth would occur. By cloning of neighborhoods, cloning of transportation network, what we attempted to do was to create a simulation of what the city is likely to look at when it reaches its terminal state. This is an unusual part of doing fire station locations because most communities have all those things in place and are evaluating the existing transportation network and the existing neighborhoods. Our number one criteria was to make sure that the level of service was equivalent to what it is today and that it will be equivalent when the general plan, or excuse me, when the master plan is ultimately completed.
We analyzed the standard of response coverage, and one of the things we did with police and fire staff was develop the 3 command area sequence that we've talked to you about before, the north, the central, and the southern portion. The standard response for fire coverage was based upon some maps that were developed with 4, 5, 6, and 8 minute time distance calculations to get. This is a highly sophisticated program that Ronnie's group has that, pretty, not precisely, but gets a requirement for a fire station within a pretty close proximity to a major intersection. The standard of coverage for police was much less stringent than fire. The one criteria that came out of one of the, I think the public safety report was that a 7-minute response time be maintained for a priority 1 call. That led us to a geographical constraint of perhaps a 5-mile distance or a 10-mile across diameter of a police station for access by a police officer to respond to any 1 call. As far as resource requirements, on the police side, we use the existing police staffing formula that has been utilized by the Goodyear Police Department and also as a national standard. There was a discussion and a response about the matrix study and how that analyzed. We've been through that before. Ron, you want to talk about the fire staffing, how you approach that?
Well, the way that we extrapolate fire staffing, of course, is to take the criteria for the station and the staffing for a particular station and then extrapolate that out over the time in which the master plan is implemented. One of the key factors which will be alluded to later in the report is the idea that this planning process is highly dependent on triggers and thresholds, which means you build stations when you need them. You don't necessarily put them there just because there is a location. And the triggers and thresholds thing backs into the idea of having an effective firefighting force that's present for whatever neighborhoods need to be protected. And that was extrapolated out over the entire time frame.
And I think the staffing was also built upon an idea of incremental growth. If we could put in a 2-person, company initially to service an area, we would do that.
Can I ask you real quick, because you're kind of going into a thought I was having. 2 weeks ago, we were down in the Sonoran Valley and saw the train tracks. And evidently there's an incredible amount of trains that go through there a day. And then to top it off, they were talking about 2 to 3 more lines added on. And so when you were stating that constraints or even amount of people, if they have to cross, we can't let a fire engine sit there at the tracks trying to get across. So I would imagine you have looked at that constraint.
To the degree that we have information that goes into the mapping environment, we take those considerations very seriously when they actually exist. For example, if you look at one of the previous maps, there's actually a gap between the 2 stations. And the reason why is because there's a wildlife corridor in there.
Right.
There's no development's going to occur, so there's no reason to put a fire station there. The same thing applies to the annual updates of this plan. is we are inferring in this report that you need to do at least an annual or every 2-year review of transportation corridors and networks,
Okay.
and look at the impact of things like that. For example, a railroad in and of itself is not a problem. But if there's no low-grade crossing, it's a problem. And it has to do with freeway design and what we call turntables. When you get the turntable information into the mapping environment, you can project those restraints.
Okay.
You're familiar with the larger document. There's a whole implementation listing of facilities and so on. I've quickly summarized them here to let you know and the public that we have identified a number of different facilities and the approximate cost per square foot listed here in today's dollars, but we've actually escalated those out towards the appropriate time when we think the facility might come online. As you know, we did some benchmarking. We compared Goodyear to other cities. You cannot always compare cities apples to apples. We took what we could from various cities and tried to consider what other cities had done as they applied to Goodyear. This table is we rank the per capita cost of public safety by city budget, and you'll see in green, I think, Goodyear is at the 2007-2008 level. Projected out to the 2030 level, Goodyear would actually fall in this chart of ranking of other cities by per capita spending for public safety. Sarah, I've tried to leave you as much as I can for the fiscal, because this is the important part.
Good evening, Vice Mayor and Council. The model that we use to evaluate the fiscal impacts is a model that we had previously developed for the city for other purposes, including when this annexation was first being considered.
Can you pull the microphone? There you go.
Sorry, I'm a lot shorter than you. In any case, we updated that model for the purpose of this evaluation. It's a 20-year model, and we projected general fund revenues based on development by type of land use in Sonoran Valley and in the city as a whole. And in all cases, we looked at Sonoran Valley separately from the city as a whole, because I think it's important to understand how that area, since it's such a large part of the city but so separated, is going to impact you fiscally. So we projected, first of all, general fund revenues, and then we allocated a portion of those revenues to public safety. The expenditures all came directly from the information in the master plan. So in the case of the general fund, we looked at staffing levels, we looked at new and replacement equipment that goes through the general fund, we looked at benefit levels and all of those sorts of things to project costs. There are various other, building maintenance costs and other things that all go through the general fund. So all of those costs are not really modeled, they're just entered in there from the information in the master plan. In addition to looking at the general fund, we also looked at the impact fee funds, again, separately from Command Area 3 and the rest of the city. So we looked at the current fee schedules in the most recent Titular Vice study, and then we looked at the actual projected expenditures from the master plan for facilities and major equipment and what year those were supposed to occur. In the case of the impact fees, since those fees are designed to directly cover the costs in that area, the comparison is fairly easy. But in the case of the general fund, of course, there are many types of expenditures that are covered in the general fund. So we had to determine how we were going to allocate revenues specifically to public safety, because those revenues they're unallocated revenues. They can shift. In this case, we used 46% of general fund revenues, which is consistent with your current budget, but it's higher than it has been in the past. And so I'm going to come back to that point, because that ends up being fairly important. Okay, so this graph shows you the annual operating general fund impacts for Sonoran Valley and for the city as a whole. Now, for 2007 through 2013, there's a development agreement in place with the developer of Amaranth that ensures that there will be no deficit or no surplus. There will be a zero balance for Sonoran Valley. Beyond that, the impacts are by and large negative through 2025. It does recover to a positive level in 2026, but then there's still some negatives in particular years beyond that. In general, it's fairly balanced after 2026, but there are a few negatives. What has happened by that point is that a sufficient retail base has been developed in Sonoran Valley to generate a fair amount of sales tax. There are also periodic adjustments for state shared revenue, state shared income, and sales tax that are taken into account. I'm assuming those adjustments are going to be made every 5 years. Statutorily, they must be made in every 10 years, but it has been the pattern in Maricopa County to make them every 5 years. So in 2026, there's a big adjustment for everyone who has moved in the previous 5 years, and so that helps, and in every year ending with 1 or 6, that is the case. So for Sonoran Valley, in the short and even midterm, it's really not covering the costs in terms of the general fund revenues from that area. Now, for the city as a whole, as it turns out, the positives in the city in areas 1 and 2, the developed parts of the city, generally outweigh the negatives in Command Area 3. And so citywide, the fiscal impact is generally positive. There are a few years where there are large staffing increases and you might see a temporary negative, but you have to remember that those staffing increases are going to occur perhaps more incrementally than we have them, and so those may be evened out a little bit. But in general, those citywide, the impacts are fairly positive. Although the point I really want to make is that that's assuming that we continue to allocate 46% of general fund revenues to public safety. That is substantially higher than it has been historically, say, over the last 10 years. And so I don't want you to get the idea that there's all kinds of extra money left over in the case of public safety, because there are certainly many competing demands for those general fund revenues. So that 46% ends up being a fairly critical figure. And I think it's valid based on your current budgeting, but I don't want to imply there's going to be lots of extra revenues. To the extent that a shortfall should occur, in the operating funds, there are some potential solutions. It is entirely likely that other large developers in that area, other than Amaranth, will also have similar development agreements. So to the extent that their revenues, because of the mix of land uses in their development, do not cover public safety costs, they will probably be on the line to cover those costs for a certain period of time. So that may help, because we're not just looking at Amaranth here, we're looking at projected development for all of Sonoran Valley. The other options include, you could have a dedicated sales tax for public safety. Mesa, for example, already has something like that. You could also implement service charges for non-emergency type public safety services. So there are certainly options should shortfalls occur. The next part of the fiscal impact is the impact fee funds. And again, we looked separately at Sonoran Valley, and I have these on different graphs because we have police and fire, which are different impact fee funds. So based on the projected development, we modeled the revenues based on the current fee structure, and then we had schedules for the expenditures. In the case of Sonoran Valley, the police impact fee funds are generally insufficient in almost every year to cover the projected cost of infrastructure. In the case of fire, the fees it ends up evening out by about 2026, but that's quite a long time out before sufficient fee revenues are generated to cover the infrastructure costs previous to that time. And even then, there are years when there are negatives because there are large expenditures in those particular years. However, this is a lot less of a concern in the case of impact fees, because impact fees are designed to cover costs, and they can certainly be adjusted given that there's justification for those adjustments. And the fees that I used, although they are your current fees, were put into place prior to knowing this detailed information about projected costs. So it is likely that adjustments will need to be made. It is also entirely possible that you could institute zonal fees. So the fees would be different in Sonoran Valley than they would be in the existing city, because the cost of infrastructure there is going to be greater because you're pretty much starting from scratch. Citywide, there is still a problem with the police impact fee fund. It's negative citywide as well, based on the projected costs in this plan. So it is likely that police impact fees would need to be adjusted not only for Sonoran Valley but also citywide, in order to, if in fact these projected costs are reasonable, which we believe that they are. In the case of fire, it does recover to a positive balance citywide by 2028, but again, that's an awfully long time, and there certainly may be interim adjustments that are required to meet the infrastructure cost demands in terms of the impact fees.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, sir.
Just to kind of finish up our portion of it here, the master plan will have quite a bit of emphasis on the implementation of facilities and staffing, when that might occur. I just have thrown a couple of slides in of each of the command areas here, kind of spotting where 2030 facilities could possibly happen. Obviously, the full master plan will have lots of detail about square footage of each of the facilities, how many staff would be there, how many vehicles, how big the site would need to be, and so on. There's a great deal of detail that certainly is not appropriate, in this forum. But I want to just quickly let the public and let you see the maps covering that area. An important part of the implementation process will be measurement and an annual review, as Ron Coleman referred to earlier, of how the city is doing compared to the projection population and development that this master plan has anticipated. New land development, how fast is it coming on, how big are the developments, all that will affect the implementation. Actual police and fire response capability on a yearly basis will need to be measured to see, can the police make a priority one in 7 minutes? Can the fire department respond to a call within 4 minutes and 59 seconds 90% of the time? If you start to fall short there, then there are some other triggers and thresholds that might indicate looking at adding staff or new facilities. That's the purpose of the triggers and thresholds. Whoops. Ron, you want to address the station thresholds? Because this is a pretty
Yeah, this
lot of
particular
words.
formula seems to confuse a lot of people with me because I wrote it. It's essentially, if I could get you to put a visual in your mind at this point in time, imagine that the microphone being a fire station. That fire station can protect an area around it we call a response polygon. And if everybody that came into the community was situated within that response polygon, there's very limited demand on improving the fire service. Then it becomes a matter of demand more than it is anything else. But the minute I put another piece of property out in some other location, when the time and distance start determining whether or not you're going to be able to do anything about an emergency that occurs in that area. If you look at the chart, you'll see that it's got multiple criteria. We call it multiple dimension variability. And what it says is that if 25% of the structures, the new structures, are more than 3 miles from that fire station, and you have at least a 10% of that area you're getting demand out of it, you better be thinking of what's going to happen out there. You better be preparing to put a temporary station out there, or you better be ready to start contemplating when the permanent station is going to be there. If it's 35% of those structures and they're more than 3 miles away, and you're getting 20 to 25% response times, that's starting to impact consequence. People are having to wait for service. Then you better be thinking about a temporary fire station. Then the way the system works is once you've got 50% of the land, we call it the FAR, the area that's being developed, BAR, B-A-R, building area ratio. Once 50% of the building area ratio is filled up, and you've got buildings that are more than 5 miles from the station, and you've got 30% response times that exceed 8 minutes, you better put a new station out there, because otherwise those people are not getting the same level of service that the remainder of the city is. The way this is done is what we could refer to as compliance methodology. And what it is, you have a very robust GIS system in your city. And that the way it's done is that every year you evaluate those triggers and those thresholds in a GIS environment. And it almost comes back and tells you exactly when and where a station would occur. Now, using my hypothetical model, I'll submit to you that if something changed with land use, or let's say, for example, a bunch of multiple high-rise buildings went in, and all of that population shrunk back, then there may not be as need for this particular fire station. But if you allow a residential occupancy to go out here, then that fire station may then be required. Does that make sense in terms of the logic of it all? It's time, distance, and demand. And when the time is exceeded and the distance is exceeded, you have to meet the demand, or otherwise the citizens aren't getting the same equivalent level of service throughout the city.
And interestingly, in this project, the fire station location probably is going to be the real criteria, the generator. The police can co-locate with fire They have been successfully up to this point in time, and as far as the locational criteria, we'll probably try and do that. There are some police thresholds, the police station, certain populations, certain distances for substations that we will, have in the master plan. There also are some initial Sonoran Valley triggers that are, listed up there. I think we've discussed these with you before. The next step for us is to come back with the final master plan, and we'll be here in about 3 weeks for that. And I just want to quickly summarize what I think the master plan, the Sonoran Valley Goodyear Public Safety Master Plan will do for you. First of all, it's going to give you a long-range vision, certainly much longer than the 2- and 5-year strategic planning level that has happened up to now. Is the long-range vision perfect? No. It's simply a recommendation. It's simply a professional's take a look at how things could develop based upon our experience. It's going to be dependent on population and density, how the city grows. We know it's going to grow. We just don't exactly know how. We have, as part of the master plan process, discussed with fire and police staff a new organizational structure for them, both as far as command area, but the master plan document will also have new organizational charts that have been worked out with them. We haven't really shown you those organizational charts because that's kind of an internal thing, but there will be organizational charts that they can use to grow forward as they add staff. There is, of course, a big component of adding staff, and how much staff and how soon it comes on, that's something to be determined, but we know the numbers are fairly significant. When you have new staff, you have to have new facilities. They have to have a place to work. That's obvious. We've tried to identify in the master plan common support facilities, warehousing, training. We really feel the need for some sort of training component in Sonoran Valley. It's unrealistic for fire and police to try and come all the way up to a proposed training center up in the north thing and efficiently utilize their time for training. So there may be need for some small training components specifically in Sonoran Valley. We'll identify in the master plan facility sizes and site areas that we think would be appropriate for you to start looking for property for new facilities. We've described how to use the existing facilities that will remain, transitional uses, and so on. We have several graphs and charts and timelines trying to show an implementation sequence based upon the population mapping that was done early on. I think early on we showed you some population maps with the yellow and the blue and the green densities. Our implementation sequence is based upon that. If those change, that's part of the annual review process that we'd have to evaluate. We've identified for Sarah, and she's plugged in the numbers, what new fire equipment costs are, what police officer training costs are on an annual basis, and so on. We've identified order of magnitude facilities construction costs, and we've escalated them out to the appropriate year when we think those might come online. There is a fiscal impact portion, a much larger section in the master plan than what you saw in the report summary that gives and goes into quite a lot more detail. We'll have more description of the triggers and threshold mechanism and the annual measurement process. With that, I'll take any questions if you have any today.
Start with Councilmember Holland.
First of all, I think it's a good plan, and it's good to know that we have that long-range vision that you just spoke of, because I think that's really important for the police and the fire. At 46% of the general fund, at what time, because looking at that timeline, and we can see that, where we're not getting the money from, because you showed a deficit in the impact fees as an example. At what point in time will that 46%, can we start looking, is it going to go higher than that? It looks like, to me, we have to find other forms of revenue.
Sarah, do you have you would be more qualified to answer that than I would.
Or I guess my question is, at what estimated time will it become less than 46%? That's quite high.
It's fairly high, yes. Now, the 46% only affects operating revenues, so impact fees are a different thing, and those can be adjusted completely apart from that. But because you have excess, because I'm showing a net positive impact citywide, it is likely that you could allocate less than 46% of general fund revenues citywide to public safety and still cover your costs. I'm gathering the number is somewhere between 38 and 46% is what you would have to
So
allocate.
we'll spread it out.
Yes, which is consistent with what you've historically been allocating to
Right.
public safety. And it's always the case that public safety is the largest expenditure in your general fund. But I would, for Sonoran Valley all by itself, apparently it's going to take more than 46%, but you know, that area is not operating in isolation. And so citywide, I think you could probably go a little bit less than 46%, even right away, a little bit less,
Okay.
and still cover your costs.
All right, because there'll be more spread, that's what you're saying.
Right, right. And there's just a lot more efficiencies in the existing city than there are in Sonoran Valley right
Sure.
now because of the existing development.
It just makes it skews it when you just look at that one part.
Right, it
So-
does, it does.
The one thing to note in this whole thing, because of the separation and because of the vast land areas and some of the geographical barriers in the city, the provision of public safety facilities is not going to be as efficient initially as it will in the end, whenever the end is. If that 2050, you know, who knows? At some point in time, you'll-
2026, more like.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you are going to go through a period of inefficiency just because of distance. And we want to make sure that we don't shortchange anybody as far as their coverage. That's the critical aspect of what we're seeing.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah. If I may, thank you, Vice Mayor. I think my concern is not so much with your presentation, and I thank you very much for very detailed, as much as you could with the information you have, bring to us tonight. But in regard to our city planning, my concern is, I hope that that the city will plan this area into a tighter village situation than a sprawl, because the sprawl thing has got to go. With transportation costs being what they are today, with all costs and the economy being what it is today, we've got to bring people closer together, because it's not going to work with us spreading everything out, especially for the fire department. Police department is on call by cause anyway, more than anything else. I know we have police, we want presence of police everywhere, but for the most part, your effectiveness of your police is by call, and can a police get there, and what is the time for a police car to get to that particular event or whatever happens. So that isn't as serious in my mind as the fire protection, because the fire protection, if we're on a sprawl situation, we're in a lot of trouble trying to service areas out beyond that. And I'm just hoping that, and I guess this is more a question for the city staff, are we going to see that is planned and built and designed and built so that it's more from the inside building out and not just one here and one there and a development over here and a parcel here. So that's a concern I have. And then the other question I have is, at 2026, do we know have we estimated what we think the population of that area will be by that time, 2020?
Yes, I think we're in the 35, 40,000. You're talking about Sonoran Valley?
Just that area, yes,
Yes.
Sonoran Valley.
Mhm.
About 35 to 40,000.
Of all the areas we've discovered, there's been the greatest discrepancy in what could be or what's realistic as far as the population.
Well, I know it's going to be difficult to tell because we don't know what the
Right.
sense of the economy will be.
I think what our assumption has been in 25 to 30 years, Sonoran Valley population could be what your city is here now. You know, that's kind of when we've been talking to staff, it's kind of try and think of the number of police staff and fire staff you have to cover your city right now. You're going to need that in Sonoran Valley, or some approximation of that in 25 or 30 years.
Okay. Thank you.
Any questions from this side? No?
No, I just think it's very logical and workable with these triggers and thresholds. It just brings common sense to it. And so,
Well, and also 46% of your
Yeah.
that helps you solve or get
It
to
does.
talk to
It
people
saves
and
you-
have a
you're not
good
gonna
reason.
spend money where
to-
you don't need to be spending money.
Right, yeah.
Earlier than you should be
Right,
spending
yeah.
the money. So I had time this weekend to finally really study this summary report, and I was impressed by that.
Well, thank you.
So,
Thank you.
thank you.
So if you have any questions, feel free to call me we'll be back to, I don't think we're going to present the whole master plan thing, because it'll be in several big notebooks, but.
This was enough this
Oh,
time.
yes, okay. Okay, thank you.
We appreciate your time. Thank you for fitting that into a tight time frame. I think we met the goal, so. Police and Fire Department, thank you. Very diligent effort. It's been a very easy read, the executive summary, as well as obviously a lot of thought and a lot of hard work put into it, and appreciate the effort. So, with that, I'm going to assume we don't have any reports on current events from council, and that the manager doesn't have any summary, and we'll give everybody 4 minutes, and we'll reconvene, or we'll start the regular meeting at 6 o'clock. We're adjourned.